Sponsored by the James Madison Council and the Institute of Museum and Library Services and the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Hello, and welcome to the 2021 National Book Festival. My name is Rob Casper. I'm the head of Poetry and Literature at the Library of Congress. Our scheduled moderator, Jeff Pegues, Chief Justice and Homeland Security Correspondent for CBS News, was called into work today. So I will be here as your moderator with our amazing pair of authors, Catherine Belton, author of Putin's People, How the KGB Took Back Russia and Then Took on the West, and Joshua Yaffa, author of Between Two Fires, Truth, Ambition, and Compromise in Putin's Russia. Joshua and Catherine, welcome to the program and to the National Book Festival.
Thanks for having me.
So my first question is for you, Catherine. Tell us, what prompted you to write this book about Vladimir Putin?
Yeah, that's a good question. I began it a long time ago when I was still working for the FT as Moscow correspondent. It seemed to me that then I was in a position of great privilege where we had access to lots of government officials and the Russian billionaires. And it seemed to me that it was time really to kind of leverage those contacts and the relationships that we've been able to build over the years to try and really delve into how it was that Putin came to power and answer the question of what really happened to the security services at the Soviet collapse and how it was they were able to accumulate so much power once Putin rose to the presidency. So these were the aspects that I really wanted to spend time delving into, a sort of a systemic look at the rise of the security services under Putin.
What do you think enabled Putin to hold on to power for so long, and maybe how the security services helped enable that?
Obviously, ever since he rose to the presidency in 2000, what we've seen has been a systemic power grab by the security services, by the former KGB around him, former KGB men around him in the Kremlin. And we've seen, first of all, this cowing of the Yeltsin era billionaires who were once known as the oligarchs because they wielded so much power in Boris Yeltsin's administration in the 90s. And Putin essentially cowed all of them by putting the richest and most powerful, one of them, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, in jail for 10 years and then taking over his oil company piece by piece. And in doing so, he was subverting the Russian court system to the Kremlin's will and essentially signaling to all the other oligarchs that they had to toe the Kremlin's line, otherwise they would face the same fate. And this is a system which is now extended further and further into the Russian economy. He put his loyal allies in charge of most strategic sectors of the economy. And when you have a law enforcement machine and a court system that's fully under control of the Siloviki, of the former KGB men, then essentially, you know, everything is now at Putin's command. As one former KGB ally put it to me, that Putin can access the whole cash of the entire cash of the country. So, you know, it's quite an effective system that they've managed to build, but it's based on fear and it's based on having control of the law enforcement organs.
Let me turn to Joshua, but first, let me remind you in the audience that you can ask questions. If you go to our website, losc.gov/bookfest, and click onto this program, you'll see on the right-hand side a Q&A. So please do ask questions. We'll get to your questions towards the end of this 30-minute segment. So Joshua, given what Catherine just said about survival in Russia, can you talk about what motivated you to write your book and how that system works if you do want to survive and even thrive in contemporary Russia?
What interested me about Russia as I came to see it in my years of reporting here, I moved to Russia in 2012 and began reporting on the country at a time of protest. This was in advance of Putin's third presidential term. There was a season of protest that was met quite harshly reminiscent of the protest we've seen of late. But starting in that time and moving forward, I was struck by how the dichotomy that I often brought to the story and we often saw reflected in Western news coverage of Russia wasn't entirely, didn't entirely capture the full or most nuanced nature of reality here. In other words, the story in Russia isn't always one of a cruel, repressive state versus, brave, dissident protesters or opposition movement. That dichotomy exists. It's real. It's not that it doesn't reflect reality, but that most of the reality I observed in the people I interviewed and the people I met in just my personal ties in Russia existed somewhere in the middle, in a kind of gray zone where people adjusted their lives, adjusted their ambitions and goals according to the ever-changing demands of the state, the shifting interests and requirements of the state. And people oftentimes set out with virtuous, understandable ambitions and goals for themselves and what they wanted to achieve in life. People with very recognizable to me, and I think recognizable to you and to American readers of what they wanted to see for themselves in their careers and their private lives. But they had to go out and construct those realities and pursue those realities in the shadow of a state that was becoming increasingly demanding, increasingly intrusive and repressive. And it was that dance of compromise that really fascinated me because I understood or could see myself reflected in it. These were very human, universal dilemmas and impulses and situations that people often face. And I wanted to bring that world to life in a way that I thought maybe wasn't always reflected in the news coverage, maybe even in my own news coverage of Russia. And I wanted to bring that interesting to me, that really fascinating gray world of compromise and these nuanced moral dilemmas to the page. Because, and to answer the second part of your question, I think that the Putin state from its outset 20 plus years ago, the rise of that system and the construction of that system is something that Catherine so eloquently and with such repertorial kind of firepower brings to life in her book. And one of the ways that it's proved so durable is that it's brought so many people on board. It's found ways, I guess you could say, to co-opt some people, to entice some people to, whether it's business people or theater directors, human rights workers. It's found ways to attract many of the best and brightest into working with the system, and along the way making small compromises that oftentimes turn into big compromises. And that allows, or at least is one of the factors that has allowed the Putin system to remain externally stable for so long. And that is, as I said, it's brought so many people under its kind of big tent and found ways to keep them there, either through carrot or stick.
In your book, you delve into the lives of a number of quote unquote strivers. Can you tell us about those folks, how you found them and what you learned from them?
Sure. Some of the people I found or wrote about in the book are relatively public figures. Someone like Konstantin Ernst, who's the head of Channel One, the national or federal television channel with the most reach in Russia. And so his position effectively makes him a kind of minister of propaganda of the Russian state, and certainly carries out that duty both with great loyalty, but also with great creative flair, I would say. And that's because Ernst, at his core, or at least in his past, was a kind of art house auteur. He had tastes that really swung toward the offbeat and left field, at least in terms of, compared to what else was available in Soviet and post-Soviet mass culture. He's a person with really refined cultural and creative tastes, and who uses the channel as a platform to indulge those tastes and interests and to air programming on Channel One that you won't find on other Russian state channels. And I don't think you would find on Channel One if it wasn't for Ernst and his very particular creative and aesthetic vision. But at the same time, he also uses his channel as a very willing and effective instrument in propagating all of the official messages and signals that the state wants to transmit to the public, and doesn't transmit what the state doesn't want the public to know. So he's very much a loyal member of the Putin system, while also using the channel and using the resource under his command to indulge his own personal, as I've said, art house, sometimes odd interests that certainly would not be the kind of thing that the rest of Russian officialdom would be interested in airing or transmitting to the public, or maybe even know about, airing the American, black humor series Fargo, for example. Putting that on Channel 1. I don't think that's the kind of thing that otherwise you'd see on Russian state television, but it's the kind of thing that Ernst was interested in, and therefore he put on the channel. Ernst was also in charge of the, I think, quite successful opening ceremonies of the Sochi Olympics in 2014, a really rich pageant that displayed Russian history and Russian art and Russian science through the years, and he did that with really great creative and aesthetic aplomb. But again, that was in a way the quintessence of Ernst. Ernst at his most concentrated, someone who both displays real creative and aesthetic vision, but also uses that creative and aesthetic vision in the service of the Kremlin interests, and does so with great energy and loyalty.
Catherine, let's turn to you. I'm curious to know what you would say Putin's ultimate ambition is. And this is a question that came from Marion that I'm throwing to you a little bit early. I'm also just curious to understand how his ambitions may have changed and what they may be looking forward from now.
Yeah, I'm afraid his sole ambition by now, unfortunately, is to hold on to power. And we see this in the kind of the deepening power of his regime. And I'm kind of interested as well in, Josh's book very much does portray incredibly well this system in which kind of a whole cohort of the elite have been forced to adapt to this group of security servicemen who've acquired power and are gripping onto it by all means necessary. And they must adapt to survive, and they can also seek opportunity through working through in that system, like Konstantin Ernst, who Josh has just described so well now. But it's kind of interesting. I feel like the system has now reached this kind of point of inflection where you had like this sort of two systems, the group of KGB men around Putin who are intent on acquiring and accumulating power, and this sort of more liberal, moderate Moscow elite who were sort of saying, hang on, we'd like to hold on to our wealth. We must adapt and somehow seek opportunities through working with these security servicemen who have so much power in the Kremlin. And for a long time, many of them have been able to do so and acquire vast wealth through doing so, and through adapting and demonstrating their loyalty and fealty to Putin's Kremlin. But it's now we've reached this point of inflection where, the economy hasn't been growing now for a long time. People's real disposable incomes are down 10% from 8 years ago. I think people are now looking around and wondering, do we share Putin's vision? Putin has been proclaiming this vision of returning Russia to its great power status on the world, that he wants to kind of try and attack the West, who he still sees as the main adversary, and do so through undermining democracies and boosting Russia's stature that way. But it seems the people, and in particular the elite in Moscow, are no longer on board for this. And you can also see them now beginning to chafe at the increasing reach of the security services, because as the economy stops growing, the pie is smaller. And those who've kind of bent this way and that to kind of fit in with the Kremlin and sort of work and do favors for the Kremlin are now finding that their businesses are being seized from them too, that it's not enough anymore to be just loyal to the Putin regime. You actually have to be one of them. You have to be one of Putin's closest allies from the KGB or from St. Petersburg. You have to know him personally in order to keep your business safe. There's been a whole string of businesses and banks that have been taken over in the last couple of years that were owned by precisely these type of people that Joshua has been describing, the ones who really tried to adapt and fit into the system. So at this really interesting inflection point now in the power structure and the dynamic, because it has been sort of quite stable, but I think now there are growing numbers of the elite who may not be able to see ways to survive anymore and fit into the system. And I think Putin also feels that, and you can see the growing paranoia of the regime. You've seen that in what happened to Alexei Navalny last year with his poisoning with Novichok. I think the Kremlin was looking with ever greater fear at the events in Belarus, where the largely apathetic, apolitical population suddenly shed its fear of the security services and amassed against Alexander Lukashenko's re-election there. And Putin was also facing unprecedented protests in the Far East. And Navalny was busy kicking up resistance in Siberia. So, you know, we saw him get poisoned and then immediately jailed when he did dare to return to Moscow in January this year. And then we've seen this very brutal crackdown on the protests that followed his jailing. And it was the case that in previous years, the Kremlin sought to modulate and adapt its response to kind of fit in with the more liberal Moscow elite and adapt to their wishes, but they're no longer paying lip service to kind of trying to have an image of anything remotely democratic anymore. And all we've seen is this crackdown, and we'll continue to see that following the elections, where they've certainly eradicated any chance for the opposition to move in on their power. So I think, yeah, unfortunately, Putin only has one aim in life now, and that's to hold on to power. I think he would continue to like to divide and disrupt the West. Obviously, he faces a bit of a different picture now that there's Joe Biden in the US. Obviously, he's less pliable than Donald Trump, though he is still making some overtures to the Kremlin following the Geneva summit in June. So I guess we have to see, but I'm afraid it's quite simple for Putin now. He just wants power. If at first, when he first came to the presidency, he might have been a little bit reluctant president, but the security service men around him certainly wanted to make sure he held on to power and accumulated it as much as possible. And then to a degree that stability would be returned to the Russian political scene, and then they could remove all opposition. And once that reached a critical mass, once the command over the economy had reached a critical mass, they were able to divert cash flows to begin undermining democracies in the West and corrupting officials and so on, as we've seen in what happened with Trump in the US and the funding of the far left and the far right across Europe. So the ambitions of Putin and his men did change and expand in trying to sort of boost Russia's standing on the world stage, not through creating a competitive economy, but through trying to undermine rivals. But now it's all about just holding on to power.
Thank you for that. Before I turn to my question for both of you, I just want to let our audience know that in addition to asking questions in our chat on loc.gov/bookfest, you can see the connection we are making not only with this event, but with all of our adult National Book Festival events to the Library of Congress collections. We have a link you can click on to read more about Putin's 2008 election in the library's Russian Election Ephemera Guide. Jack asks what you both think will happen after Putin. Obviously, he can't live forever, and it's apparent that he isn't grooming anyone in particular to follow him. So what do you think will happen both in terms of leadership and in terms of the country?
Well, I think as Catherine has laid out very convincingly, the whole plan for the near and medium future is to prevent exactly that outcome, or at least to project outwardly both to political elites close to the Kremlin, the public at large, and to Western governments, that Putin is here to stay, and Putin would like to, as it were, kick the can down the road as long as possible to avoid just exactly that kind of discussion. That's a conversation he doesn't want to happen inside his own kind of palace quarters, as it were. He doesn't want Russian elite to begin to think about a post-Putin future. That would make him as we call it in America, a lame duck, right? It would see his power lessen immediately were people to begin to look toward the future and what future centers of power might be. Nor does he want the Russian public, I think, to begin to contemplate a post-Putin future, because he wants to retain the singular role as the system's figurehead and its chief arbiter of the internal clans and factions that Catherine has talked about and documents in her book. And so I think, all resources have been directed towards exactly this question. We saw this with last summer's constitutional referendum, the point of which really at its essence was for nothing more than to give Putin the right to run again in 2024 and even in 2030 after that. So at least projecting the air of a kind of eternal, unquestioned hold on power is fundamental to Putin keeping power today. In other words, projecting power into the future is what allows Putin to retain power in the here and now. And in the Russian political system, surviving until tomorrow really is the chief goal. It tends to be a system, a very tactical system, not a strategic one. So for Putin to survive another night in the Kremlin, as it were, he needs both the elite around him and the public at large to think he'll be here another 5, 10, or however many more years. That said, but before turning it over to Catherine and listening with interest to what she might say about this hypothetical, or as not hypothetical at all, right? For reasons of biology, if not politics, there will be a post-Putin future for Russia at some point. But the question I'm interested in, and I address in the last chapter of my book, is what will this transition, this generational transition that the passage of Putin from office will represent? It won't just be Putin leaving the political scene, but it'll be this whole generation of men, and largely men first and foremost, who occupy positions of power in the political system. What happens when they fade from the political stage, and young people, the so-called Putin generation, people who were born already under the Putin presidency, that's Putin's rule has been going on for 21 plus years. So there's now a whole generation of young people who've known only Putin as their leader. What happens when they ascend to positions of power in not just politics, but in the economy, business, society? And will they have the same habits and adaptive habits of compromise, those that I write about in my book? Will they be as willing or kind of thinking first and foremost about how to attach themselves and insert themselves and adapt to the rules of the game and to try and benefit from those rules of the game? Or will they have a more kind of demanding attitude? Will they insist that that the system somehow reflects their values and their ideals rather than adapting themselves to the system? Will they expect the system to adapt itself to them? That's still really an open question. This Putin generation is quite young, but as I've said, for reasons just of brute human biology, at some point Putin and his generation will fade from the scene, and this younger generation will take over. And it'll be an interesting sociological experiment to see whether they can transcend some of these habits of mind and sort of socio-political habits and ways of operating that very much came out of the last years of the Soviet system, the kind of the doublethink and the cynicism that were very much the kind of lingua franca of those late Soviet and early post-Soviet years. This is a generation that doesn't have that firsthand experience. So, will they conduct themselves differently? And that's a really interesting question that I think we'll only see the answer to when it happens, right? It's sort of a game that has to run itself out for us to understand the outcome.
Yes, Catherine, what do you think? And I'm curious, especially in terms of those that sort of security apparatus that has controlled so much of Russia for so long.
I mean, this is exactly the key question, the one that Josh is asking. I mean, I guess that, and in a way that it's split, because on the one hand, you have a whole new generation who've only known sort of Putin, who've only known the Putin era, and many who've also grown up in the ranks of the security services. They're incredibly motivated, very well educated, but they also continue to perceive the West as the main adversary, as the enemy, and they're sort of they've grown up in an era where the security services have had this all-encompassing reach and power. So in a way, that's quite dangerous if one of them, say, were to come to power, because we've seen sort of situations where kind of like the FSB or kind of other members of their cohort can sort of go in, take over businesses, raid them, and carve up the proceeds for themselves without any oversight or scrutiny or kind of any resistance from society. So, you know, if it's one of that contingent that comes to power, then probably we're going to be in trouble. But then on the other hand, I mean, if you look at attitudes across the population, then, I mean, there was a recent poll by Levada which showed that a kind of well, almost a majority, I think 44% wanted Russia to treat the West as an ally rather than a rival, and it was a much smaller number, I think 33%, that wanted the Russian regime to treat the West as a rival. So, I mean, attitudes are changing in the wider population, but it depends sort of how deep now is the grip on power by the security services, and certainly Putin and those around him in the Kremlin in an effort to ensure some kind of stability once the biological clock runs out on them. They've been promoting their own children to positions of importance in the economy and in the power structures themselves. They have, you know, their sons are all in charge of like the country's biggest banks and other kind of big state institutions, you know, without some of them having any business experience at all. They've certainly been getting rapid grooming in it in these positions. So they are trying to sort of create this transfer from within their own ranks, and if that happens, then again, that's not great for the country. But it may be that you know, we see somebody more moderate from the Moscow elite who is intent on re-establishing relations from the West, and that we will see one of these swings. Because I guess what we have seen in the history of Russia over the centuries is that there can be sort of quite sharp swings from kind of anti-Western autocratic systems to more liberal pro-Western ones, and they do kind of occur with quite regularity. It's just that the country has never seemed to find anything in between yet.
Thank you. And for my last question, I'd just like to talk about your comment, Catherine, before we started this session, that Russia follows you, and what has it meant for both of you to write about Russia, both from inside Russia and from the West?
Yeah, I'll answer quickly. So I left Russia in the summer of 2014. And I left to finish my book, and it was the case then that many of my sources in Moscow were more and more uncomfortable in speaking with me there, because the Ukraine crisis was at its height. The West had just imposed sanctions on Russia, and so I moved back to London thinking I'd be able to finish the book quickly. But it turned out the story had really followed me into the West. This was at a stage where the Putin regime had already accumulated so much power within its own country. It was now seeking to acquire influence in the West and begin its influence campaigns to try and undermine democracies in the West and stoke the rise of the far left and the far right. So it became almost for me a never-ending story. I couldn't just leave and kind of write up the notes that I'd had from my kind of time reporting in Russia, but it became a much bigger story about how Russia was seeking to expand its influence beyond its borders. And indeed, many of my sources also followed me into London, whether into forced exile or whether they were just visiting and more free to speak without looking over their shoulder. So yes, the story does follow you, whether that's for good or for the bad.
Joshua, what about you?
I've been really fascinated to follow the characters in my book, not just through the period that I was reporting on them and then writing the book, but after. And that's, it's of course expected that something like this, the moral gray zone of compromise with the Putin system, especially as it's become increasingly repressive and increasingly inflexible, that's not a process that has an end point to it necessarily. I'm thinking of someone like the theater director, Kirill Serebnikov, who's one of the main characters of my book, a really extravagant, experimental theater director, really renowned in Moscow cultural circles for his cutting edge productions. For a while, he was able to bask in the largesse of the state, even though he himself is clearly someone with liberal leanings who creates really avant-garde works. Nonetheless, for a while, he was able to receive state support for that work at a time when the state was interested in having this kind of at least appearance of supporting or sort of flirting with the experimental avant-garde. He then fell out of the state's favor in this crisis moment that Catherine described after the Ukraine standoff, and fell from grace. He was eventually charged with fraud in a clearly politically motivated case. But then he wriggled out of those fraud charges as the mood changed again, and he was released first on house arrest and then given a suspended sentence that seemed to suggest he was again in the state's favor. And then after all of that, after the book had already come out, he was then removed from his post as the head of a high-profile theater in Moscow. So following the twists and turns of someone who at a time had found a way to insert themselves into the Putin system, then had found themselves on the outs of the Putin system, then back in, then out again. Following the twists and turns of the characters in the book is something that's been really fascinating to me, and I think is a reflection of what's going on with the Putin system writ large.
Well, thanks to you both. Unfortunately, we're out of time. There are many more questions I'd love to have you answer, but instead, I just want to say thank you to both of you. Catherine Belton, author of Putin's People, How the KGB Took Back Russia and Then Took on the West, and Joshua Yaffa, author of Between Two Fires, Truth, Ambition, and Compromise in Putin's Russia. Thanks to you both. Thanks to our audience. And I hope you all continue to check out the book festival at loc.gov/bookfest.